In this research by Donna Babisaha from 2011 discusses about gender discrimination and the connection to gender stereotypes at work. Patriarchy refers to male domination, to the power relationship by which men dominate women, and to characterize a system whereby women are kept subordinate in a number of ways. It's a fundamental factor of the oppression of women, which is highly linked to gender and sex discriminations. The major causes of sex discrimination are rooted in cultural beliefs. Secondary causes relate to organizational structures, policies, and practices. Not only in the neoliberal capitalist context, the oppression is served in various ways, primarily through language, kinship relations, stereotypes, religion, and culture. There are essentially two types of stereotypes that play notable roles in expectation for women's labor, which are descriptive stereotypes and prescriptive stereotypes. Descriptive stereotypes involve beliefs about traits that one gender has. This should convert to discrimination when traits associated with the stereotype are incompatible with the traits needed for the job or task in hand. And prescriptive stereotypes state beliefs about traits that one gender should have. It creates more hostile reactions as others punish women through discrimination for deviance from gendered expectations. In neoliberal capitalism, under the pre-existing system of patriarchy, this underlying prescriptive stereotypes for women brings about a sexual division of labor. This is the key element that assigns women to restricted social and economic functions related to caregiving and unpaid works, such as household labor. This oppression of women enables capitalists to manipulate women's workforce to make a high profit at the lowest cost. Women's work under the patriarchal influence allows capitalists to justify their exploitation and denigrate the salary of women. The statistic conducted by Conane suggests that even today, with equal amount of work and equal amount of hours, women are paid approximately 20% less than men.
In this reading from Week 6, Gerwal discusses the shift of context for the idea of human rights from exclusively in the political sphere to common discourse as a linguistic tool to speak about injustice on both a governmental and non-governmental scale. In particular, there is attention paid to the ways in which these supposedly universal standards interact in conversation with relation to women's rights in different cultures and economies. It also brings up the topic of how the interests of those who enforce laws from one locality to the next often clash with the concept of a universal set of human rights. When discussing the feminization of labor, fair wages, and working conditions, there is always the question of equality and protection of rights here, and we are able to get a better grasp on the complexities of these subjects. The topic of women's rights as human rights is a continuous thread throughout the texts and articles in our research. Even if not overtly referenced, it appears implicitly. We can see this most prominently in the way women's labor continues to be exploited, both domestically and in the workspace. By extension, exploitation through low wages and poor working conditions leads to the devaluing of occupation as a whole. The concept of women's work as a way to mean unskilled, invaluable work leads to neglect and even active mistreatment of the people performing the labor, who more often than not are women with little say or option to change their working conditions. To give more context and build upon Gerwal's reading, I have included two supplemental papers. In this text, Mo Gautam discusses globalization and its impact on feminist networks, as well as going over income gaps and the informal sector of work. The latter portion of the text touches on the topic of public versus private sector work, and the variation in compensation and equality within each. It's interesting to note that despite being more qualified and skilled in some cases, women are still earning less than men in private sector. So the idea that higher education and qualifications are all that is required for well-paying jobs becomes obsolete. Regardless of skill level or education, there are still areas where the defining bar against equal treatment and pay is a gender bias. Mo Gautam writes, The process of the feminization of labor continued throughout the recessionary 1980s, not only in the manufacturing sector, but also in public services, where throughout the world, women's share has grown to over 30 to 50%. During this time, where the impacts of the global market are really starting to hit, and the push towards production and the generating capital is taking off, more and more women are being hired into labor-intensive jobs where the conditions for working are becoming poorer and the wages are decreasing. She then goes on to say that at a time when public sector wages, like industrial wages, have been declining, in Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, women's share of public service employment, including jobs as teachers, university professors in public schools and state universities, nurses and doctors in state hospitals, workers and administrators across the ministries, has increased. This has occurred at a time when salaries have eroded tremendously and more men are gravitating towards the lucrative and expanding private sector. It is evident then that women are being left to fill the gaps that men have left behind for greener pastures. And as they fill these roles, the value of the occupation decreases, not because of demand, but simply because employers do not value women's work and can, due to societal pressures and general norms, get away with underpaying and undervaluing the work these women are doing. Moving on to an article from 2012 by Gordon Galshet and his peers that covers the topic of gender segregation in the workforce and the effects of globalization and the impact processes of expanding to a global market has on the gendered gap in wages. They determined that occupational segregation is still the leading contributor of gendered wage gaps, while globalization and the increased access to higher paying jobs only marginally affects this. This is an interesting line of inquiry because it gives further insight to the social institutional components of gender bias in the workplace. The intentional placement of individuals of a specific group, such as women in this case, into a particular occupation in the hopes of cutting wages or increasing productivity through social constraints and pressures is a deeper cut into the wage gap, showing that there is less a matter of interpersonal discrimination as it is an institutional and governmental structure put in place. Galshet writes, Paula England argues that the revolutionary changes that have transpired since the 1960s have slowed. She identifies numerous interrelated factors that may account for this declaration, including the continued devaluation of women's paid and unpaid work, the stalled movement of women into male-dominated occupations, and the continued inequality in heterosexual relationships. This quote ties into the point that gendered bias of work is not overt and interpersonal. The reason for the gap in these situations is caused by a number of factors, but most notably is that occupations that have historically been categorized as feminine, such as childcare work or work in service industries, have significantly lower pay rate than other jobs, with the same or similar level of education or training that are not traditionally feminine, such as trucking. Women are expected to perform these tasks and be paid less because their work is viewed as unskilled, and they are ultimately dependent on men or by extension the government. And so, especially in the global south, they are socially classified as secondary earners, which in turn justifies abysmally low wages.
This article by Lisa Kowalchuk from 2018 discusses the intersections of neoliberalism and the devaluation of women's work, and specifically the care sector, in Nicaragua. Kowalchuk writes, in the devaluation of care thesis, gendered notions of who is suitable for care work play a decisive role in how we value care. The thesis holds that caregiving work is undercompensated because women are deemed to be enacting innate tendencies and abilities, not exercising a set of learned skills and scientific principles. Because of the gendering of care, women's work as nurses in Nicaragua is undervalued despite many nurses attaining bachelor's and master's for the field. In the 1980s, many neoliberal policies were implemented to remedy the financial crisis, which we learned about briefly in Week 2's reading of The Southern Debt. The neoliberal policies implemented in Nicaragua in the 1980s did not lessen the burden of caretaking for women. In fact, it made it worse because it privatized certain aspects of the healthcare sector, creating barriers for the poor and emphasizing the responsibility of women as caretakers in the home. The undervaluation of nurses' work is represented through their earnings. In 2012, the nurse's monthly base salary of about $140 covered about 37% of the urban basic market basket, defined as food, clothing, and household essentials, including fuel, electricity, water, and transportation. The monthly salary for nurses does not even cover 50% of expenses for living. So many nurses take on a second job in order to make a livable salary. This means many nurses take on double shifts, two 12-hour shifts, therefore 24-hour days, so that they can accommodate days in their schedule for a second job. Not only are the nurses overworked, but the ratio of nurses to patients is highly inadequate and contributes to even more stressful environment. The system's failure to augment the number of nurses' positions to keep up with increasing demand suggests a view of nurses' physical and mental capacities as highly elastic, and a view of care work as something that comes naturally to women. Due to the frontline nature of their jobs, nurses find themselves subject to the frustrations from patients, which results in verbal abuse and occasional aggression. Rigoberto, a key informant, who was a nurse, teacher, and leader, agreed that patients' expectations of services in the MINSA facilities were heightened since 2007, and regards this phenomenon as gendered. They, the patients, perceive the nurse as the employee, the domestic, the woman of the house, the mother who has to do everything for me. When it comes to organizing to protest their treatment and salaries, nurses are dissuaded due to the fact that they do not have their own union, but are a part of a larger organizational group known as Health Workers Central, Vet Salud. In addition, Health Workers Central is highly affiliated with the government party in power. One interviewee observed, "I feel that the union staff are more with the administrative personnel than with us, and so they always rule that management is right, and it shouldn't be that way because the union is there to defend us as workers." The treatment of nurses in Nicaragua is one example of the many ways that the gendered notion of care is undervalued because it's deemed as women's work.
In Ruben Gale's article, The Traffic in Women, Marx's theory is implemented in order to describe how women are exploited by capitalist systems of governance. Women are considered passive and detail-oriented, whereas action is deemed a masculine characteristic. Then, when productive, women's labor is credited to a progenitive workplace, or a woman's productivity and worth ethic is exploited as capacities for relationships, emotional aspects, linguistic aspects, and one's propensity for care is assumed intrinsic, that gender and stereotypes are cognate and not valued as qualities, abilities, and individual skills. Women both manufacture a product but too foster workplace relations and stimulate co-workers to sustain and maintain efficiency, but are not even compensated in equal wages for production, although expected to transcend job descriptions and duties according to stereotypes and gender bias. Gale notes that if the total value of the things the worker has made exceeds the value of his or her wage, the aim of capitalism has been achieved. Therefore, women's labor is conducive to capitalist structures. Yet, if we are moving towards or find ourselves within a cognitive capitalism, then perhaps all work is interjecting itself into domestic and personal spheres. In the article, The Feminization of Labour in Cognitive Capitalism, Christina Marini writes, "One fundamental aspect is less so the separation between work and the worker, to bring into play emotions, sentiments, the whole of one's life outside of work, as well as territorial and social network means, in fact, to make the whole person productive. What has to be thoroughly examined, therefore, is this new nature of work, being part of active life rather than just work, clearly separated from the biological, reproductive, emotive sphere." Whereas the second wave and Beauvoir would reject the domestic and housework, separating work from quotidian acts, post-feminism would accredit this emotional work and acknowledge housework as work, not separating the two. During the pandemic, most work takes place within the home, and so everyone is expected to juggle both the emotional and productive realms. In cognitive capitalism, precariousness, mobility, and fragmentation become constituent elements of the work of all persons, irrespective of gender. Stereotypes of women being more capable of care are commodified during a pandemic, as they are more likely to be productive despite the circumstance, as we have always been made to care.